Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of In the Barn. I'm Robin.
And I'm Kelsey, and in today's episode, we're going to tackle part 3 of the bit versus bitless debate. We are going to try and answer the question, can you ride in a bit or hackmore without causing your horse pain?
Well, bit or bitless bridle is what we're looking at.
Can you ride in a bit? No, bitless and just bish. I don't have time for you.
All right, cue intro music.
If you just found yourself screaming at your phone saying, of course you can ride without causing pain, first off, love the enthusiasm. But second, bear with us as we are trying to determine what the science says. Even better, go and check out part 1 of our bit versus bitless debate or part 2, which was last week's episode of the bit versus bitless conversation. Last week, we dug into Dr. Robert Cook's research and looked for the hard facts, and we'll listen to last week's episode to see what we found out, if anything. We even posted a bonus episode that you're going to want to check out too. Also, don't forget to swing by that old Apple Podcast app to leave us a review. As I mentioned last week, we are on a mission to collect all the stars we can, so help us out by leaving a review on our podcast page. You can also subscribe and share the podcast with your friends. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode.
Yes, don't be afraid to shamelessly promote us because we're not afraid to shamelessly promote ourselves.
I actually am terrified. I'm actually terrified. Like, I've thought about it a couple times, being like, when people ask questions in certain like forums and like chat groups, I'm like, hey, I have an episode that like talks about this, and I like try to be real, like just like listen, like we actually are trying to answer questions that people have, and then people are like, no, and say weird things, and you're like, oh my gosh, please just.
Anything on a Facebook forum is scary. I don't have the guts in me to respond to a single person because I'm not ready for what keyboard warriors could dig up and respond to me. Also, they just say mean things.
Also, like, it doesn't matter what you say. You could have the correct answer, because this has happened to me several times. You're like, my answer is correct. I am 1,000% correct. And whoever's like the original poster or someone will comment like, you're wrong. It's like, but I'm not. Oh, there was one where saddle fit is really important for young horses because young horses change so much when you first start riding them. One of the first things that I think most people don't know is that young horses who've never been ridden start with like 0 withers. They start like flat backed. And as you start riding them, their withers grow. Okay, so your saddle is going to have to go from wide to narrower, and then as they start to develop muscle along those newly developed withers, then you have to go back out to wide. Most people don't know about the going narrow part, and so ride in a saddle that's too wide for too long. And I said that comment on a Facebook post, and like, I got jumped all over. That's not true. It doesn't happen that way. And like an actual very real saddle fitter had to jump in and be like, actually, she's totally correct.
Anyways, not that has anything to do with bits or bitless.
No, it does not. But yeah, so that's what we're talking about today. It's episode 3. We're going to try to kind of dive into the pain factor and try to answer that question, like how much pain is involved with using either a bit or a hackmore or a bitless bridle, whatever you've chosen to ride your horse in. Is there pain? Is there not pain? I don't know.
I'm glad we did the other parts of this discussion before we got to the pain topic, because I feel like pain is really the main argument people use. And I feel like it's always the first statement people say is like, well, a bit causes so much pain, or bitless can be just as harsh because the nose is sensitive, so it also causes pain. So I like that we were able to talk about everything else that has to do with bits versus bitless before getting into the pain discussion, because it's not the only argument for or against either option.
No, it's definitely not the only argument. There's quite a few, as we've seen. But I think it is a big factor, and it is such a sensitive part of the conversation because nobody wants to believe that they're causing their horse pain. Everybody wants to do what's right and ride their horse the best that they know how. And I think it's really hard when we're looking at so many riders it's just so easy to fall into the trap of like, they do it so I could do it. Or if they're doing it, it's fine for me to do it. And we're not like, I'm not causing pain because their horses are fine. It's just like, it's so hard. It's one of those things that if you really aren't conscious and paying attention to the subtle signs, and this isn't just bit versus bitless, this is everything horses. If you're not really tuned into those subtle signs, it's so easy to miss. And it's really unfortunate. I hate the arguments that like, well, my horse isn't in pain because see this photo. And it's like, just because your horse isn't screaming in pain, it does not mean there isn't a level of uncomfortableness. It doesn't mean that there isn't discomfort happening. And why do we have to wait till our horse is screaming at us before we like pay attention? Shouldn't a like simple swish of the tail, why isn't that not enough for you to pay attention? That's what like I think is so frustrating with a lot of these topics, is that why are we waiting for our horse to be so miserable they can no longer take it before we start to pay attention? So I was riding Nim yesterday, and we're going through our bitless transition, and we've been working a lot on bending exercises, a lot of serpentines. And I noticed when I was working on these serpentines that with my leg pressure at a certain point, he would swish his tail. And he would say, that's enough pressure. And to me, I was using like the bare minimum on this horse. Most people would not have thought that I was using a lot of leg pressure, but he's super sensitive. And so it was enough. And he would swish his tail and say that was enough. But if he hadn't been doing what I was asking, like he was doing what I was asking, I didn't need any more leg pressure. But had he not been, I think most people would have been like, oh, he needs more leg pressure, and not have noticed that that tail swish probably meant he didn't understand what you were asking and he's uncomfortable. And so it's just paying attention to those little signs and saying, okay, well, what else is happening? A tail swish actually means something. Yes, it could be at a fly, but then go and test that theory. And that's what I did. When I noticed he was swishing his tail at certain points, I was like, is this in response to my leg? And I went and tested, okay, if I put my leg on, do I get a tail swish? Got a tail swish every time. So I was like, okay, connected the dots. That means he says I'm using enough pressure. But if he wasn't bending and circling around my leg like I wanted, then he would have been saying, I'm confused, more pressure isn't going to help. And I think that's where most people just see that and they're like, oh, I just need more. Okay, you ready for this?
Yeah, let's dive into the research now.
Okay, so I'm going to start by introducing us to David Mellor. Maybe it's Mayor. It's Mellor. He recently published a study in 2020 titled Mouth Pain in Horses, Physiological Foundations, Behavioral Indices, Welfare Implications, and a Suggested Solution. So he basically went through a lot of research that's already done, a lot of existing literature, and he compiled his review of the existing literature and research. Yes, he does quote Cook several times, his research several times throughout the study, but my initial thought was like, that's okay. I'm just going to know when those references are and decide to avoid them or to like dig a little deeper if I need to in those instances. So I did read it. I didn't love it because it felt very Cook-esque, very much like we're very heavily leaning one direction, but this was an actual published review of the literature. And it had some really insightful things talking about the horse's mouth anatomy. He talks about sort of the tissues that are within the horse's mouth, that they are very soft tissues, and how the mouth works. Like the mouth is a very complex region of the body because it can like do so many different things. It can react to touch, it can react to thermal events, it can react to pain. Like in such a small area, it has a lot of receptors that are, taste and touch and heat and pain all in your mouth. The associated impulse, once one of those things is felt, is then transmitted via the trigeminal nerve to the lower regions of the brain and then upward to specific areas of the sensory cortex. Here, the impulse is then processed in a particular conscious sensations in ways that also identify their sites of origin. For example, gums, palate, other area of the oral mucus, teeth, tongue, muscles, and facial skin. Taken together, these sensations provide information about the state and structure of the mouth itself and objects within the mouth, including foreign bodies. Moreover, the richness of the sensory innervation means stimulation of oral tissues generates bodily experiences that can be among the most intense possible. The only issue with this I have is this actually comes from a human study and not a horse study. And I was getting really frustrated because, this is probably exactly how horses' mouths operate. Like they have a trigeminal nerve. We talked about it last week with the head shakers. This is how they operate. People just aren't, I could not find the research, and I'm sure it exists, but like no one was really studying how the horse's mouth works and interprets and does, feels. Like I could not find that research. I'm sure it exists in some veterinary science like textbook. I'm sure there's lots of research, but every time I was looking at mouth anatomy and mouth stuff, it was all about teeth and dental work. And it's like, that's great. That's part of the mouth, but there's a lot more there. So the point of this was that Mellor did use this to kind of talk about how sensitive the horse's mouth was, and that sensitivity in the mouth can then be felt elsewhere in the body. And this is one of the reasons he explains that, like, some of those things Dr. Cook said about horses having fear and that, like, emotional stress of the bit could potentially be true. But again, no one's doing this research in horses. A little bit about other parts of the horse's mouth that I thought was really important is the tongue. Let's talk about the tongue. So the tongue occupies most of the entire oral cavity. There is no place for the bit in the horse's mouth. If the bit is in the horse's mouth, it is taking away space from the tongue, and the horse has to adjust how they're holding their mouth. They can't hold it in a natural position. And I thought that was really interesting because we just assume that the horse has an interdental bar, therefore there is a place for the bit, right? There's no teeth, bit can sit there, but you forget that they have this giant muscle in their mouth that takes up a huge amount of space. So if you're putting a bit in their mouth, it's taking away from the tongue. And most of us want to put a bigger bit in our horse's mouth because that translates to being kinder, right? More pressure area for that pressure to be distributed.
Disperses the pressure instead of having like one sharp area of pressure. It has a wider, duller pressure.
Right. But if you're doing that, then you're taking away more space from the tongue. So it's the tongue that then starts to play with the bit more because it wants to separate out the non-edible objects and get them out of its mouth. So that's why you see a lot of horses using their tongue and playing with the bit because they're trying to get the bit out of its mouth. The other thing to keep in mind is that the soft tissue on the lower jaw or in the interdental space is really thin. It's about 2 to 3 millimeters of soft tissue, and that is with a lot of nerve endings that are feeling a lot of sensations. I don't know, this hasn't happened to you, but anyone who's ever worn dangly earrings, this is kind of what I thought of, is that they start so light. You put a dangly earring in your hand and you're like, that is so light, that's not gonna bother my ears at all. And within like maybe half an hour, maybe an hour, maybe if you've worn them all day, your ears hurt so much just from those earrings sitting there. And it's sort of the same thing with the mouth and with the bit. Even if it's just sitting there and no pressure is applied, it starts to that weight starts to amplify. Same thing like if you've ever held a box, right? Like think about you've held something and it didn't start heavy, but after like several minutes, it starts to get heavier. And yes, your muscles are wearing out and getting tired, but like it's sort of the same thing with the bit just sitting there. It starts to get heavy. And then the study also talks about like rein tension. When rein tension is applied to the bit, it's multiplied because that bit is so much smaller and that pressure is so small. That area for the pressure to be dispersed is so small. It has more pressure than you think it does than you're adding. It's not a 1-for-1 trade-off, and that it's often going to be increased. So those are some of the things he was talking about when it comes to the mouth and the bit.
But did he have any like study stuff behind it, or was his just kind of...
So he was referring to other research. Like I said, he was referring to human research in order to apply that to how the horse's mouth would feel. And this is what I kept running into because I wanted to okay, what does the horse's mouth feel? What is the research? And it's just not there. I could not find it. I have a lot of studies and we're going to get into them in a second about damage to the mouth, but no one's just talking about, most of us aren't causing damage to our horse's mouth with our bit. What does the horse feel if it's just sitting there? I don't know. He did this. So this is the guy who invented the Mellor pen test. So what he tells you to do is to take a pen. And in most of us, right, put a pen in our mouth and we lay it across our teeth and against the corners of our lip. And we say, how could our horse feel pain if the pen or the bit is just sitting in my mouth like this? I don't feel pain, right? And so his suggestion was instead of just holding it in your mouth on your teeth, because that's not where horses would be holding it, is to take the pen and pull out your lower lip, put the pen against your gums, and see how much pressure you can take on your gums on your lower jaw. How much pressure can you take with that pen sitting there? Is it a lot of pressure? Is it a little bit of pressure? That is more reflective of what the horse is actually feeling than just holding a bit or a pen in your mouth. And I'm not doing it right now, but I did do it earlier. And I was actually surprised that you could feel, it was uncomfortable the second, obviously, it went against my gums, but it was the amount of time after I removed the pen that I felt it for. That was actually what surprised me the most, is that I feel for another 10, 15 minutes, I could still feel the pen, and I didn't use that much pressure. I don't know how much pressure I used. I didn't have any way of measuring it, but I think it's a good reminder that it's not sitting, the bit isn't just sitting in the horse's teeth. The bars have a lot of feeling and a lot of sensitivity. And so try the pen test, put it against your, the gums below your bottom teeth, and like close your lip and pull. And how much pressure can you take, and how much, I don't know, did you like it?
See, but like you said, I wonder how accurate that is. I wonder if that is what the horses are feeling.
I don't know. And I don't know how do you quantify it? Like, how do you do it? Because, right, like, you can't ask a horse, like, on a scale from 1 to 10, like, give them that little frowny face chart. What frowny face are you? Like, you can't do that with a horse. So you're looking for these other signs, and it's really hard because a lot of these other signs are, so if you're looking for outward signs, so a lot of studies, Dr. Cook, that's what most of his studies are, is looking at outward signs of pain. Those could be associated with so much. Like, yes, the easiest way to test is if you just take the bit out and put a bitless bridle on, and do those signs go away? But even then, it's like we talked about, it could be bridle fit. It could be where the like buckles are sitting. It could be so many different things that it's really hard to know for sure if those signs are caused by the bit. It also could be caused by dental issues. Does your horse have bad teeth? Like, so much easier. But his study does talk a lot about, horses that show outward signs. Could be horses that we have referred to as being like dead in the mouth or have like a really tough mouth. That could be just a horse that's shutting out that pain, and they've decided to ignore it at a certain level. And that dead in the mouth doesn't mean they've lost feeling. It just means they're ignoring because they have to like shut it out in order to be more comfortable. And I remember like our mom, I remember us having this conversation that if a horse is like grabbing the bit and running, that is a sign of fear, and that you should always go to a softer bit and not a harsher bit. And I always I wonder how she got to that conclusion, because I very like vividly remember this because we were talking about like a friend's horse specifically who was a very like hard mouth quarter horse that they wanted to go up and put something stronger, a stronger bit. And my mom kept trying to tell them, like, no, that's not, your horse is telling you that they are uncomfortable with what you're putting in their mouth, and you need to find a softer, gentler bit. And I'm like, how did she know that? Like, how did that occur to her? Because that was, very much against the thought process at the time.
Yeah, and she was always one that was very stickler proponent on teaching us that if you ever think that you need to go up in your bit, that's when you need to especially be moving down. Like, you never fix any of your issues by increasing the severity of your bit.
Yeah, and she moved a lot of our horses to hackmores, like the gaming ponies to hackmores, because they would run through the bit. And it was, they're telling you they don't need a bit, like the bit's not working, change it up. And I just think that's really interesting because that's just so counter to what most people's belief is. And I think it's true. Like, I don't think it ever failed that it wasn't that, maybe the horse wasn't afraid of the bit, I don't know, or they didn't understand it, or we just hadn't found the right bit and the right size, the right fit. But I do think there is something there that you don't necessarily need to move up, you need to move down. I'm going to come back to him in a minute because, unfortunately, while his research is great and I really appreciate it, when he got into quoting other studies, he started really misquoting them to the point where it was like, but let's talk about inward signs of bit issues. And so I know most of us are going to hear this research and be like, that's not happening to me. My horse isn't that horse. I would never, this doesn't happen. And the point of me sharing these studies is really to just point out that it's happening in every community. Every horse riding discipline, every horse riding barn and community, this is happening. And it may not be you, but do you know to look for it? It may not be you, but can you see it happening to someone else? It may not be you, but it is happening. You might be surprised how often and with what bits it's happening with. That I'm starting to think snaffles may not be the best choice anymore, and that they may not be as gentle as we think they are.
Single jointed or double jointed?
Single jointed for sure. Get them the heck out of here. Double jointed, I'm a little bit more confused with because they do sit so heavily on the tongue. It makes them a little bit harder to move, so they're not getting into the roof of the mouth, but then you have this whole tongue issue, and they can't move their tongue to the roof of their mouth to swallow because the tongue has to go so they can do the breathing correctly. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's confusing because I don't think there's a better option with one or the other. And then I come back to Mullins, but then Mullins are just so much thicker. You again have that tongue issue where I think Mullins might be better of the options. But again, I'm not 1,000% sure. This study is, I was not able to find the actual study itself because it costed like $50, and I did reach out to the people and ask for it, but apparently they don't actually get back to you, and that's just a scam.
No, they never do.
They say you can reach out and ask one of the researchers, but I'm sure those emails are like 1,000,000 years old at this point. But the study is called a cross-sectional epidemiology study of prevalence and severity of bit-induced oral trauma in polo ponies and racehorses. So while I couldn't find the actual study, I was able to find several articles that reviewed it, and these two articles, the information they were providing was similar enough that I felt comfortable saying I understood the article, that it likely reflects the study correctly. I found two different articles, one from Horse Talk New Zealand, which is researchers probe bit-related injuries in racehorses and polo ponies, and the second one, titled published by Horse Science, was Racehorses and Snaffle Bits More Likely to Experience Oral Trauma Than Polo Ponies and Gag Bits. The study was used to identify, grade, and compare the types of oral traumas commonly found within polo ponies and racehorses. Injuries were assessed visually and by palpation on the tongue, lips, corners of the mouth, and interdental space. A total of 50 polo ponies and 50 racehorses were sampled in south of England. Racehorses with snaffle bits were predisposed to significantly higher severities and prevalence of oral trauma than were polo ponies and gag bits. Only polo ponies were observed with tongue trauma. Racehorses had higher severities of injuries to the corners of the lips and bone spurs, and there was a positive correlation that was found between the age and or time of the sport and the induced bitting injuries. Polo ponies often have been playing for longer before injuries occurred. Racer horses showed the highest incidences of injury from bits, and the most common trauma was light abrasions to the corner of the mouth. And it's also really common to see depigmentation. So like a horse that has black lips, if the corners of the mouth are turning pink, that's a sign that the bit is rubbing on the corners of the mouth, and that it might not even be to the level of an abrasion yet. Tongue lacerations showed the lowest prevalence and severity and only occurred in polo ponies, and there were 6 polo ponies that had tongue incidences and some signs of pinkness. Racehorses had more severe bone spurs and injuries to the corner of the mouth than polo ponies. What they found was, in part, was that polo ponies had been playing much longer before they had injuries, and that they believed the injuries were in relation to the amount of training and time the horses had trained. Because racehorses were trained in snaffles and much quicker, they believed that led to some of these injuries, where polo ponies had to go through a much more rigorous process for training and be much more dependent on the rider's seat and legs as part of their training than racehorses. However, the study kind of assumed that polo ponies would have higher injuries because of like how quickly they turn and stop and how much steering is involved versus a racehorse that just runs in a straight line. But their belief is that the racehorses are trained so kind of like quickly that there isn't that time given to developing aids.
Interesting. I actually never would have considered the training that goes in behind the scenes. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, but immediately when you said racehorses versus polo ponies, my instinct was to assume like a polo pony in a match. I figured because they stop and turn quickly, they would have the higher lacerations and like injuries in their mouths.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what everyone's sort of assumption was when they went into this study, and they're using gag bits, right? And curbs are so much stronger than snaffles, so
yeah,
they multiply the pressure on average. If you put 1 pound of pressure, it turns into 3 pounds of pressure on a curb bit or on the gags that these horses were using. And so, yeah, you would think that that quick stop, those tight turns, all of that would be causing that pressure on the horse's mouth. But if they do ride with short reins, I'm not going to lie, they're not riding with no pressure. And of course, you can find tons of polo horses with their mouths gaping open. I guess maybe the bit's not moving as much, and the gag bits don't put as much pressure as the snaffle, so they don't apply and sit in the same areas.
You know what I actually wonder about in relation to that is think about where polo ponies tend to carry their heads, and think about where racehorses, especially like when, I mean, I know when racehorses are in a race, but when you see them training, they're typically cranked in a little bit more, sometimes to the point of hyperflexion and stuff. I wonder if the angle that the bit is being carried at the mouth at those different head positions, if that has an impact.
So that was something that I did find mentioned, is that once a horse lowers its head past a certain point in a snaffle bit, that snaffle bit is then going to be pushing. So that nutcracker effect that we're so familiar with our hands also occurs when the horse puts their head in a lower position. Oh. So if their head is more level, that nutcracker effect isn't going to happen. But if they start to lower that head and your hands are above that head, then the nutcracker effect is going to happen again. So there's like an area of tolerance where they can avoid it, but that may not be where you're riding the entire time.
Oh, that is so weird. Did it say that if that was like when they started going behind the vertical that the nutcracker action would happen? Or is that any time when we typically think of the horse being round and on the bit?
So they were saying that it was, and this is in like this was not in this study. This was in one of the articles I found. So they were saying that it was happening when the horse was like below its chest, or below withers. So once they got below their withers, and whether they're doing that like deep and low stretching, or at least that's what the photos they were showing is when it occurs. In a training level frame and on vertical or in front of vertical, it should be fine. But once they start going below that training level frame and start to get stretchy, maybe a stretchy chewy circle, that is when it would occur.
What an interesting result to find. That just makes it so confusing then of how we were training our horses to stretch and reach for the bit.
And then the other theory was that, because they were riding in snaffle bits, the riders felt like they could be heavier in the hand. And then that could be what's leading to these, where riders on polo ponies felt they needed to be lighter and have horses that were more responsive to their aids, and that's what made a good polo pony. But then it's hard to know, if you're looking at the quality, right? Like you could be looking at high-end polo ponies, or you're looking at low-end polo ponies. You have to think of those, what level of riders are you looking at?
Yeah, there's a lot of room for variables to change there, and that changes the outcome. Change the facts, change the answer.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that happens all over. The issue with David Mellor is, one, cherry-picked his numbers, and two, lied.
Uh-oh.
And I can forgive him if he explained why, because he misquotes the Danish study real badly, and I can forgive him after reading the Danish study, but you gotta say why you misquoted them. I accidentally fact-checked him. I wasn't my intention. I thought I was gonna believe him. And he said 64% of the finished trotters had a presence of lesions, and that a lot of them also had, a high percentage had blood in their mouths. And I was like, well, that's actually not what the study says. You're not wrong, but that's not what the study says. So the Finnish trotters, they examined 261 horses, of which 219 had acute lesions in the bit area, so 84%. And Finnish trotters are racing horses with the buggy carts, is what these are.
Okay.
In Finland. So in total, they found about 21% had mild lesions, 43% had moderate lesions, and 20% had severe lesions. Visible bleeding outside the mouth was observed in 2% of the horses, and further 5% had blood when the bit was removed. 84% had mouth lesions. That's a pretty high percentage. I'm guessing they also have a lot of pressure, I would imagine, when you are doing that kind of cart driving. I mentioned the Icelandic one where they had found about 26% of the Icelandic horses had lesions in their mouth that occurred to the gums. And then in 94% of the Swedish horses, they found ulcerations or mouth blisters in those horses. So it's happening, whether it's happening to you or not, it's happening in your community, and you know someone that has a horse that has mouth lesions. Okay, so the last study I want to talk about is the 2017 study, Lesions Associated with the Use of Bits, Nosebands, Spurs, and Whips in Danish Competition Horses. So this study is actually really kind of cool. I really appreciate the work they did, but their conclusions be crazy. And you know what? It's hilarious because I saw the person's name who did this study, and I was like, I'm gonna fact check you, honey. I'm gonna buy this paper. I'm going to read your conclusions, because last time we talked about one of your studies, you and I disagreed heavily. So this is that one of the researchers associated with it is Hillary Clayton. I had some doubts when I went into this, but I found lots of it's her own interviews saying this information that is so confusing. Mellor's misquote is that 9% of Danish horses in dressage, show jumping, eventing, and endurance competitions had lesions in the corner of their mouths, and some were accompanied by visible blood. So that's what he says in his study, which is partially true, but then the study goes on specifically to say bitless is just as bad as bridles, and that bitless causes just as many lesions and blood in the horse as a bit, which again is not possible. It's not possible, because how do you say and maybe it is looking at the bitless, because I do know what bitless or Hackmores they were using, maybe it's possible, but then you look at the numbers and it's not possible when you look at the numbers. So the purpose of this study was to look at the type of spurs, bits, nosebands, and whips that were being used, and to measure the noseband tightness in horses competing in events sanctioned by the Danish Equestrian Federation, and to relate these findings with the frequency of lesions associated with their use, according to the Danish Equestrian Federation official classifications. The objectives were to provide data describing current use and adjustment of specific types of equipment and their association with externally visible signs of injury. So what they did is they went to a bunch of shows between February 2014 and December 2015 that were sanctioned competitions. So it'd be like going to a USCA show. And they looked at 3,143 horses. So let's give them a round of applause for statistical, whoa, you finally got a statistical relevant population. Like 3,000 horses, well done. Basically what happened is they trained a bunch of national delegates or stewards they had to be trained and licensed to conduct these measurements. And what they would do is after a horse came out of its class and re-entered the warm-up arena, whether it was after a dressage test or a show jump, pull the horse and do all of these measurements to the attack and equipment and look for blood and measure the noseband and they looked at the spurs and the whips and all of that stuff as well. I'm not going to dive into what they found with spurs and whips, but you know what they found with spurs and whips. So these national delegates were trained. They had a specially made multi-tool device that was custom designed and manufactured for this study that was used to determine how tight the noseband was on the horses. Because this was happening at a competition, they had to abide by the inspection rules of the competition, which meant they couldn't look inside the horse's mouth. They could only look at the outside of the horse's mouth and do external examinations. They recorded lacerations, blood, all as oral lesions, lacerations of the skin inside of the mouth, because they did turn their lips down and look at that skin. So all of that was put in as an oral lesion, no matter where its location was. And I do think that's sort of important to consider, because if you're riding bitless, but you have cuts to the inside of the mouth, do you think the bitless caused those?
Depends on where they are. If the bitless put pressure on hooks on the teeth, but there's no way they would be able to see that if they couldn't open the horse's mouth.
Right. So they were able, they couldn't look at the tongue or the bars. They were just able to look at the lips. If you're doing a tattoo check on a thoroughbred.
Then no, a bitless wouldn't have caused that.
Right. And that's what I'm kind of confused by, is that their conclusion, which we'll get to, is that bitless is bad. Horses, they also looked at the nosebands, and we'll talk a little bit about nosebands because it is slightly important to this conversation. Overall, 9.2% of the horses had lesions and or blood visible in the corners of the lip. Lesions on the skin and not the corners of the lip were present in 3.8% of horses, with blood recorded in 0.6. Lesions to the skin around inside of the lip was present. There was injuries to 6.1 of those horses, with blood found in 1%. The presence of lesions in the corners of the lip differed by disciplines and increased with the level of competition, but it did not differ between bit types, including bitless. Lesions at the corners of the lips were related to the tightness of the upper strap of the noseband. Cabezon Mexican, grackle, and figure eight are all essentially the same thing. Tight upper nosebands were associated with more corner of mouth lesions. Neither the presence nor tightness of lower nosebands, flash, drop, Micklem, Mexican, influence the prevalence of lesions in the corners of the mouth. So that conclusion is that you can have a really tight flesh noseband, but that's not what's causing the injuries. It's the really tight noseband that's causing the injuries.
I have a study that can rebuttal her study.
Which is perfect, because I want to hear it, because Miss Clayton, I have words for you. Okay. So in a 2018 article with horse.com, it's called Bit, Noseband, Spur, Whip Lesions in Competition Horses Studied. She is quoted, and I think this is an interview with them, as saying, surprisingly, Clayton said the researchers found no difference in oral lesion incidences between bitted and bitless bridles. Therefore, using a bitless bridle did not protect against the development of oral lesions, she said. She also noted that bit type did not affect lip lesion prevalence, as with bitless bridles, foregoing nosebands also had an unexpected result. I have an issue with this. She said horses that did not wear a noseband had significantly more lesions in the corner of their lips than horses that wore a loosely adjusted noseband. Therefore, removing the noseband completely did not protect the horse against developing lesions at the corner of the lips. There is sometimes a tendency to think that less is more. This study did not support the idea that riding bitless or without a noseband was better or kinder to the horse in terms of reducing lesions and blood in the corners of the lip. Okay, so let's get into what her actual numbers were, because I read this article, I read her quote, and I was like, girl, I don't understand how that could be possible. First off, when she's talking about bitless and she's talking about either a side pull, a very large mechanical hackmore, or that smaller jump hackmore with like the fuzzy noseband, the one everyone's got at least one in their tack room, but no one uses it. Okay, so that's what she's talking about when she's talking about bitless, because I don't have the raw data sheets, which, man, I would love to have 3,000 raw data sheets, because those are all endurance horses, because that's the only place it would have been allowed. Maybe it was in some of the low-level jumping shows, maybe. But again, she doesn't say who was wearing what, but looking at the pictures, because she did provide pictures of the equipment, that's endurance equipment. So if we're going to say that they cause lesions, could we think that was from the shanks and from having something inappropriately fitted?
Yeah, potentially. Looking
at the pictures, I mean, mechanical hackmores have really big shanks. So could we say that maybe it's from that? I think it's reasonable. However, when I looked at the numbers, out of 3,100 and some horses, how many do you think were riding bitless?
Maybe like 10%, 10 to 12%.
Ooh, I didn't check that. 46. 46 horses, whatever that translates out to be. Sorry, I didn't do the percentage on that one. But 46% of the horses were riding in a hackmore. One horse had an oral lesion. So how can you extrapolate that means nothing was better? One horse out of 3,000 was wearing a hackmore and had an oral lesion. But again, we don't know where that oral lesion was, because she grouped them all under one category. Dublin, I don't know what my horse does. He always has cuts to his inside of his lip. He's retired. I have not ridden him in like 2 years, and he still gets cuts to the inside of his lips all the time. That look, you could absolutely say that is a riding injury. I jerked the bit too hard and he bit his lip or something. He hasn't been ridden in 2 years. Also, 10 horses were using bitless and a snaffle, but that's not bitless. So I don't know how you're using bitless and a snaffle.
Yeah.
Especially when the hackmores you showed as your examples of bitless, because she has photos, are a side pull, mechanical, and a jump hackmore. And 10 of those horses and 0 had mouth lesions. There were 227 horses that were in a curb bit. 13 had lesions. Curb and snaffle, so a double bridle, was, I think, this is where the numbers start to not make any sense, 2,569 horses were riding in a double bridle. 24 had mouth lesions. Now, the issue is that she says 24 is 8% of 2,000. It is not. It is like 0.9%. And so I fiddled around with the numbers trying to figure out like what she did wrong. And I can't figure out where the typo is. The next one gets even crazier with her math. Snaffle, 291 horses were using just a plain snaffle. 250 had mouth lesions. She said that's 9%.
That's not how math works.
It's not how math works. And I double checked all her other numbers just to make sure I was doing percentages correctly, because I'm not good at math. So there's something going on where either she's writing down the numbers wrong, she's transposing them wrong. Can't figure out what she's actually doing. But how did you come up with 9%? 250 out of 290. Girl, is not 9%. What surprised me out of this was back to my theory about snaffles not being as kind as we think. 250 horses had oral lesions? Or is that 25? Like, that's what I'm like, I can't figure out, like, is it really 250 or is it 25 or is it 50? Like, I don't know what the actual number is.
Yeah, that's so odd.
Because I don't know where she's getting that weird percentage. She also, just to like drive home how like weird her math is, said that she, 28 billion, 9 million and 30, 16,762 horses were checked at level 4. I'm going to go out on a limb and say they did not check 28 billion horses. So what I'm trying, so there's a lot of math errors in this, and I just don't know where they're coming from, and I don't know what numbers to understand. The other thing she did, which I strongly disagree with, is that she put bitless horses into the no noseband category.
What?
And I don't think that's fair, because I think bitless horses and a hackmore, that is a noseband.
I think it's only a noseband.
Right, and so I'm confused as who all is in the upper noseband only and the no noseband only and the lower noseband only. Like, who's just running around in a flash? That doesn't work. And so I don't understand her categories, and she didn't have like photos or explain them very well. But what's really frustrating is that she's taking this and saying that bitless is not any kinder, and yet her numbers don't make any sense. Journalists are publishing this and saying that this is fact, and she's being quoted. And you published these tables and they don't make any sense. And I'm really frustrated by that, because I don't understand. If it's true that 46 horses were in a hack more and one had an oral lesion, how can you say bitless is just as bad?
Yeah, there seems to be some conflict of information in that one.
Yeah, and so that's why I'm really confused. Is like, so Meller quotes this study, but he just quotes the 9%, and it's like, sir, I would have loved for you to dig into this. Like, let's shine some light on what the heck is going on, because she's directly countering your point and saying bitless is not kinder, don't use it, or it's not any better, don't think it's any better. You're trying to say bitless is better, but nobody wants to talk about what is actually happening. And I don't have the raw data sheets. I don't have the Excel spreadsheet. So I don't know what the answer is to this. I'm really curious to hear what you said. You said you found a study that like contradicts this. I'm super curious to see what.
So the one that I found that I would think kind of directly contradicts that is one that was published in May 2017. And it was a preliminary investigation into noseband tightness and oral soft tissue damage. Now, they do not have the excessive pool of horses that she had of 3,000. They also didn't ride the horses in the nosebands. What they ended up doing was they took 16 different horses and had their riders and their grooms put their normal bridles on and tighten down the noseband to what their typical tightness was. Once they confirmed with like the indentations on the leather that yes, that is your typical noseband tightness, they measured how tight it was, ranked that on a different scale from 1 to 4, 1 being that they couldn't fit any finger beneath it, 2, they could fit 1 finger, 3, they could fit 2 fingers, and 4, where you could fit more than 2 fingers. They ranked the tightness in nosebands, removed the bridles, and then did a full dental examination on the horses. And when they did the full dental examination on the horses, they noted different soft tissue damage. If there was damage around the left canines, if there's damage around the right incisors of the teeth. So they were looking throughout the whole horse's mouth and would score the soft tissue damage in their mouths. And what they ended up finding was that there was no significant relationship between noseband tightness and those that had soft tissue damage in their mouths.
Interesting.
Even though some horses had severe soft tissue damage in their mouths, it didn't correlate with the tightness of their noseband.
Interesting. So it would have just been whatever was in their mouth then, theoretically?
Yeah. In theory, it'd be whatever was in their mouth. It could have been, they don't talk too much into if the horses had all been recently floated. I assume they were. They had a veterinary dentist, Guillermo Alvarez, conducted all the dental examinations. But when they went through and were scoring the horses, their noseband tightness, as well as scoring like the soft tissue damage, they also had notes on what they were constituting as a soft tissue damage and stuff. Like one of the horses was a young horse, smooth cheek tissue near the lips, but then they had ulcerations from sharp edges of their upper premolars on the left side. So they noted where this damage was coming from, and it looks like it was more caused by their teeth than it was by the tightness of their noseband.
Makes sense. Like, dental care is so important. I think the theory for so long has been that like when the cheek pieces, tight cheek pieces and tight nose bands are putting pressure, right, on the skin, and that's rubbing it into the teeth. And if you have bad teeth, then you're going to have injuries.
Yeah. And so when they were going through it, though, they did note that while these horses, some of them had severe soft tissue damage that should raise concern and need further investigation, they couldn't link. There was no significant correlation between the tightness in the noseband and any soft tissue damage to the mouth, which I think is really interesting and kind of directly contradicts what she was saying.
Yeah.
And the reason why I was looking at this one was, one, I was having a really hard time finding studies that actually looked at the pressure that bitless options have on the horse's face. It feels like not much has gone into it. Most people have just kind of identified that the bit causes pain. So if we remove the bit, we're home free, like we're safe, we're in the green. And that's not necessarily true. And I mentioned this to you before. I can't tell if the research doesn't exist or if I just can't find it.
Yeah, I know.
Is it in a different language and I can't read another language, so I don't know if, there's been a bunch of different German studies or something.
That is actually an interesting point, because the only reason I was able to find that Dutch study is because Hillary Clayton is an American professor. And so I wonder, because all those studies that we were referencing, none of those were American studies. So I wonder if we're able to find them on American Google because there's some like connection to America in like one of the researchers or the publication. If it's all being published in Germany by Germans, we might never find it.
I guess I really only was looking at I was trying to figure out, what kind of pressure bitless options are having on our horses' faces. I didn't look too much into Hackmore's. I more or less was just looking at what we kind of think of in terms of like the Dr. Cook or the Nalanta bridle, those types of bitless options was what I was really trying to look into. And the first thing I started thinking about was with the anatomy of the horse's face. There is about 3 different studies out there that have looked at tight nosebands and have concluded that tight nosebands cause problems to our horses. They increase the horse's heart rate, they increase the eye temperature, which has been noted to be a great measurement of a horse's, or not a horse necessarily, but animal stress levels. Is increased eye temperature shows an increase in their stress levels, and that has been proven throughout a couple different studies. They also noted that a tighter noseband increased cortisol levels and reduced temperature in the horse's facial skin, which was not due to relaxation in the horse, but is attributed to a tight noseband reducing blood flow and hindering circulation to the horse's face. So all this is to say that we know too tight of nosebands tightened beyond that traditional 2-finger measurement, cause issues to our horses. They have physiological effects. They cause physical damage to our horses and the sensitive nerves in their face. So it makes me question certain bitless bridle options that you have to tighten down sometimes beneath that 2-finger measurement in order to make them actually work on the horse's face and not just slip around and pull like the cheek pieces into the horse's eyes,
Yeah, big issue, because I know like the side pull is very much like a noseband. And even like we both have wheel ones now, and even the wheels you have to get fairly tight in order for them not to flip around, because when they're too loose, my poor mare Addie just like goes from side to side. I feel like we're drunk because like it's just has too much movement in it. So you want it nice and snug, but then you've opened up that can of worms.
To need it to be nice and snug so it's not rotating on their face, you have to tighten it typically beyond that 2-finger measurement, which we know causes issues. And most of these bitless bridle options fall right where a traditional cavesson goes. They're not super low like a drop noseband or anything of that nature. They fall right where a traditional noseband, crank noseband occurs, which I think makes it fine to kind of compare a bitless bridle to some of these noseband studies. But I also found a study that was published in 2017 that looked at horses tolerate similar levels of bitless and bitted bridle pressure. What they had was their goal was to see if the voluntary acceptance of rein tension in a bitless bridle compared to that of a single jointed snaffle bit. They had 21 leisure riding school horses, and they used 4 different kinds of bitless bridles. They had an LG bridle, which is like a flower style Hackmore type thing. So it's not quite a Hackmore, but it's that flower style bitless option.
Yeah, it's the wheel, right? Like it's basically a circle. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the wheel, but it was so many more circles involved. I was like, oh my gosh, okay.
Yeah. I know what the flower looks like. There's like 1,001 designs of the flower wheel sundial. It's complicated.
Yes, so they use one of those. They also use the Dr. Cook bitless bridle. They use the Fred Ray rope, which is essentially kind of a rope halter Bozell hybrid thing. They also compared a side pull, and they compared these 4 bitless options to a snaffle bridle and a conventional rope halter, actually. What they did was they attached the reins to the surcingle, leaving them loose enough that when the horses were standing there, they could carry their nose in front of the vertical. And then they put a little spring measurement on the reins. That way they could measure the rein tension at all times. And they ended up sticking a bucket of feed in front of the horses and would encourage the horses to reach for the feed. And to reach for the feed, they had to reach against the pressure of the reins. They did all 21 horses. They picked the bridles in random order, so the bridles weren't being consistently applied in the same exact order. That wouldn't be affecting them. They did this 3 times a day for several consecutive days in a row. And what they found was that all horses pulled their heads to about the same amount of rein tension, regardless of which bridle they're in, regardless of the bitless option or if they're in the snaffle. And they pulled to about an average of 7 pounds before they decided that was enough and the feed wasn't worth it. The only exception was that the side pole bitless bridle seemed to cause the most severe reactions, and all the horses would stop pulling a lot sooner, which is around 6 pounds or a little less.
Interesting. Because, yeah, side pull is like often thought of as like the gentlest one or like the simplest.
Yeah, and they attributed this to the side pole's noseband, where it's typically stiffer and thinner. All the horses didn't want to pull against. They also noted, though, that, surprise, surprise, ponies and draft type horses were more likely to accept a higher level of rein tension and were consistently pulling a little bit harder than their warm blood and Arabian counterparts.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, it's go figure. You know, the ponies were willing to pull harder to get to the food than the little Arab.
Oh, ponies.
Another question that I had, because they had a range of horses in ages. They had a range from 4 to 24 years old. So I started wondering, you know, if desensitization, oh my gosh, I cannot talk today. When we kind of think of the pressure of the bit on the horse's face, do they get desensitized to that pressure over time? Do they get more used to the bit sitting on the bars of their mouth, as well as like bitless option? Would they get desensitized to that over time? And they noted that age and what number of repetition they were on didn't influence the rein tensions that the horses chose. I feel like we've kind of been presented this idea over time is that the horses will get used to the bit or bitless options. They'll become desensitized to it. Maybe they'll become duller to it. But it appears that didn't influence them on what their preference of rein tension was. It didn't influence them on when they stopped reaching for the food.
Yeah, that's interesting because, right, yeah, you would think that an older horse, you'd only have to use a little bit of pressure because you've worked with him up until this point, and that's not true, that he's still going to push through the same amount of pressure.
Or I would assume a school pony, you know, they become duller in the mouth, or we say they have a hard mouth, they'd be more willing to put more pressure on any of the options, bitless or bitted, regardless, to get to the food. And that turned out to not be true. What had the highest impact was their breed.
Yeah, what I think it's interesting because to me, that goes back to this assumption we make about a horse that's, you know, dead in the mouth is not dead in the mouth. They can still feel, they are just done feeling. Like they have elected to stop. Why was side pull? Would they stop sooner just because?
They said because, the thinner and stiffer, they assumed that it was a harsher noseband to them.
Interesting. So I guess that means because I want a side pull, but that means I need to be careful of like how thin it is. I need to find a thicker one.
Think of in terms of that one study, I guess, with the race horses versus the polo ponies is...
That's true, yeah.
I mean, we look at bits and we know bits have different severities. You have what we traditionally think of as a snaffle, whether it's single jointed or double jointed, and you look at a French link, you look at a gag, and those are traditionally thought of as more severe. So I think bitless options run along those same lines where we have the typical, the Dr. Cook bitless bridle, a halter are different severities than that of a side pole or a hackamore. And then you also have your different severities of hackamores with short shanks and long shanks. So I think it just depends, and you have to know with the side pole that your horse is probably going to be way more sensitive to it. So if the horse's threshold was at 6 pounds, you should probably stop at like 3.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, you know, just back to, the conversation we also had about the snaffles, that you're seeing more injuries in the snaffle, likely because people think it's kinder, that like the snaffle and needs to be you need to be a lot more careful with it than I think most people realize, is that these lighter, softer options are not the lighter, softer options unless you treat them like that. You need to treat it like it's a curb bit. You need to treat it like it is, you know, a twisted wire bit. You have to treat it just as carefully as you would a more theoretically aggressive bit.
And I think this study proves that is the same with even bitless options, is if you have the least severe bitless option out there, the horse was still only preferring 7 pounds of rein tension, regardless of the severity of it. You know, the only exception was the side pull, but the other options, even with the bit in their mouth, they only wanted a certain amount of rein tension. So just because you're bitless doesn't mean you got to use and be heavier in your hands. You still have to be soft and gentle and care for it, which I think kind of puts me back on the fence between, you know, do I prefer bit or bitless? I think I prefer having the option. But when I think about it and you have to treat it with the severity and like treat it a lot gentler, it goes for all the tacking equipment we're using.
Well, and that, goes back to the you have to stop using the like good hands argument in order to make an excuse for using a bit. It's like, well, that also applies to a bitless, that also applies to a halter, that also applies to a whip. Like you have to be, you know, so conscious of the pressure and the cues you're giving and the way you're using it, so that you're not inflicting harm on your horse. And so I was reading Catherine Rolfe's webpage earlier today, and she is an upper level dressage rider and trainer, and she has her own side pull bridle available. And she did a podcast not that long ago on bitless as well. And, it's a great reminder that like the issue with the bit is when you take the bit to the horse instead of take the horse to the bit. And we have to start changing that mindset that you don't get to pull ever. You need to start thinking that you are trying to offer the bit to the horse, that you are trying to get the horse to accept the bit. And this isn't, I think so much of us, so many times we're taught that like more contact, more contact, more contact, hold more, hold more, hold more. And that's not how you get the horse to give. And that's not how that is pressure, and that is too much pressure at a certain point, and that is not okay. Regardless of the piece of equipment you're working on, you have to change that mindset. You do not ever get to pull. You don't get a pull. It's still a great reminder that like it's, whether you choose to go bitless or not, or ride in a bit, there's still so many other factors. It's not just the bit, it's not just the noseband, it's all of these things combined. And it's really easy, I think, to think I'm doing good in one area and make a mistake in another. Like your noseband's got to be the right tension, your bit's got to fit. Like I think that's something huge that people don't understand, that bit fit is just as important as saddle fit, and that like you need to make sure you're using an appropriate bit for your horse's mouth. You need to make sure you're not hyperflexing or riding behind the vertical. Like all of these things need to be in place, and if you mess up one of these, it doesn't matter how kind your bit is, you're causing issues or harm.
I think this is why I kind of fall on the line of I am not opposed to bits. I think I use them cautiously as well as use bitless cautiously, and that you can cause damage with a too tight of a bitless option, just like you can cause damage with a bit. And the most damage comes from hyperflexion. No matter what method you're using, do not hyperflex your darn horses.
I think it's something that like I'm comfortable being a bitless person. I'm having fun switching them over. I am like, yes, there's some retraining, there's some dullness. I will say the one thing I have noticed, I've only probably done like 6 or so rides, he has not once grabbed the bit and bolted on me, which is something he would do no matter what bit I was using. He would get these like random, I don't know, it would just be like a random panic attack, grab the bit and bolt. And obviously in a Hackmore, he can't grab the bit, but he could still throw his head up and bolt. He can still have that same reaction to something, and he isn't. And I don't know if that's because we've been doing a lot of walk and trot mostly, if it's because we're not doing a lot of high speeds, or we're not, cantering and trotting a lot when it normally happens. But I'll be curious to see if he has his little panic attacks where he just like bolts for no reason whatsoever, or if that was him being just afraid of the bit.
It'll be fun to see how both our horses start coming along as we begin to introduce some bitless options into our work, into our sessions.
No matter what line, if you are riding bitless, to make sure you are paying attention to those subtle signs. Don't wait for your horse to bolt and dump you before you're like, maybe he doesn't like the bit. Maybe he doesn't like the Hackmore. And, for the other thing is like, Addie does not like the wheel Hackmore. Nim is cool with it. Addie is not here for it. She rides best in her halter. So I need to find her something that's like, I wanted to try a side pull because I figured a side pull is closer to a halter. And now I just want to be careful. I find a good side pull because she's just like, simplify it, make it simpler. She doesn't need the extra gizmos. She responds best if it's just like, if the pressure is easy, light, and like it makes sense. She doesn't want it. And I never found a bit for her that she liked. The Nath was as close as we got to a bit that she liked. So I do think she wants a side pull or a Hackmore or something. I just got to figure out what.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for sticking with us to the end of the episode. If you guys have questions, comments, concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to us on Instagram at inthebarn.pod.
And I did make an In the Barn email this week because I was trying to do something else and it didn't work for what I was trying to do. But inthebarnpod@gmail.com. Yeah, email us your questions, your thoughts, your theories. We want to hear it. Like, feel free to reach out with whatever you have.
We will see you guys next week. Stay safe, stay classy, and stay in the saddle.